Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I've been working two jobs for about 6 months when I moved into this tiny two-room flat. My bedroom shared a wall with my neighbor's place. The guy was 27 and apparently had no concept of basic human decency. Every single night without fail, he'd fire up his gaming setup around 10 p.m. and play until 4 or 5 in the morning. That alone wouldn't have been the end of the world, but this guy had serious anger management issues. When he started losing in whatever multiplayer game he was obsessed with, all hell would break loose. He'd scream at the top of his lungs, calling other players every name in the book. Then came the sound of controllers or keyboards being hurled across the room, followed by his fists pounding against our shared wall like he was trying to break through it. I was pulling doubles at both my jobs. I get home around 9 p.m. hoping to catch maybe 7 hours of sleep before my morning shift started. Instead, I'd lie there listening to this maniac, having complete meltdowns over video games. My alarm was set for 6 a.m., but most nights, I was lucky if I got 3 or 4 hours of actual sleep. After the first week, I decided to be reasonable about it. I knocked on his door one evening before his usual gaming session started. I politely introduced myself as his next-door neighbor and explained that the noise levels at night were keeping me awake. When he asked what noise I was talking about, I told him about the yelling and wall punching affecting my sleep since I needed rest for work. He claimed he wasn't that loud and said he could do whatever he wanted in his own place. I tried to reason with him, asking if he could keep it down after midnight, but he told me it wasn't his problem and slammed the door in my face. A few weeks later, I tried a different approach. I left a polite note explaining my situation and asking if we could work something out. The note disappeared, but nothing changed. If anything, he seemed to get louder. One morning, after a brutal night of wall pounding, I decided to give him a taste of his own medicine. I set up my sound system facing the shared wall and queued up a playlist of artillery fire, machine gun battles, and explosion sound effects. Then I left for work with the volume cranked up. When I got home that evening, there was an angry note taped to my door calling me every name he could think of. But that night, his tantrum session was just as loud as always. This went on for months. I was barely functioning at work from exhaustion. My boss had already given me a warning about my performance, and I was terrified of losing either job. The housing market was brutal, and I couldn't afford to move. Saturday night rolled around, and I had finally planned something to take my mind off the situation. 4 friends were coming over for our monthly poker game. We've been doing this for years, just a casual night with some beers and low-stakes cards. Around 10:30 p.m., right on schedule, my neighbor's nightly freak show began. My friends could hear everything through the wall. One of them asked what that psycho was doing over there, so I explained this was my life every single night. When they asked how I dealt with it, I told them I didn't sleep much. The screaming and wall pounding got progressively worse. My friends were getting annoyed and the constant noise was killing the mood. Someone suggested we turn up some music because the situation was ridiculous. We cranked up the stereo. Since everyone had different tastes, we ended up with this wild mix of death metal, techno, and industrial music. It was loud enough to drown out the neighbor's tantrum. And honestly, we were having a great time. About an hour later, my friend stepped outside for a smoke and came rushing back in. He warned us that police were pulling up and someone had called in a noise complaint. We quickly turned the music down to a reasonable level and continued our card game. When the doorbell rang, I answered it calmly. The officer told me they'd gotten a complaint about excessive noise coming from my unit. I acted surprised and invited them in to see for themselves that we were just having a quiet poker game. The officer stepped inside and they could hear our conversation and some background music, but nothing unreasonable. We had our cards laid out, a few beer bottles on the table, and we were talking in normal voices. The officer explained that the complaint claimed this had been going on for hours with constant loud music. I told them we've been like this all evening, just hanging out. That's when inspiration struck. The wall pounding from next door had started up again. I asked if I could inquire whether my neighbor had called this in. The officers couldn't tell me directly, but their expression said everything. I then asked if they'd mind me showing them something since I wanted to file my own noise complaint. I led both officers to my bedroom. When we got close to the shared wall, the neighbor's screaming became crystal clear. He was calling someone a cheating piece of garbage and threatening to smash his console. Then came a series of impacts against the wall that made the officers jump. One officer expressed shock at the noise and asked how often this happened. I explained it was every night from 10 p.m. until 4 or 5 a.m. I told them I worked 2 jobs and hadn't had a decent night's sleep in months. I mentioned trying to talk to him multiple times, but he didn't care. The officers looked at each other with that expression cops get when they realize they've walked into a much bigger situation than expected. They said they needed to go have a conversation with my neighbor. They walked straight over to his door and pounded on it. I could hear the entire exchange through the thin walls. The officer identified themselves and told him to open up. When my neighbor asked what the problem was, they explained the issue was him filing false noise complaints while he was over there screaming and banging on walls. They ordered him to keep it down immediately. My neighbor tried to defend himself by saying we were playing loud music. The officer told him they'd just checked our place and we were having a quiet card game. Meanwhile, they could hear him throwing tantrums from the hallway. What happened next was beautiful. They explained that he was getting a written warning for noise violations and that calling in false complaints was a serious issue. If he kept this up, he'd face real problems. When they came back to update me, they were almost apologetic. They said they were sorry I've been dealing with this and gave me a card. They told me to call them directly next time he pulled this garbage because I could press charges for disturbing the peace. That night was the first time in months I slept through until my alarm went off. My neighbor's gaming sessions became significantly quieter, and the wall pounding stopped completely. His plan to get the cops to shut down my poker game had backfired completely. Instead of getting me in trouble, he'd gotten himself an official warning and put himself on the police department's radar for future complaints. I've been doing security work for years when I got the wind farm job. I sat in a guard shack making sure nobody messed with the expensive equipment scattered across these rolling hills. The company figured the biggest risk was hunters taking pot shots at the turbines, so they needed someone keeping an eye on things. The site had this old dirt road cutting right through the middle of it. For decades, locals had used it as a shortcut to get to their cabins and hunting spots on the back end of the property. Most folks were pretty understanding when the construction company started requiring badges to get through. They'd stop by the office during the week, fill out some paperwork, show their ID, and give their access pass. Simple enough, but there was this one guy who thought the rules didn't apply to him. The first time I met him, he came roaring up to my checkpoint in his pickup truck, windows down, already yelling before he even stopped. He immediately demanded to know if I knew who he was. I told him I didn't, but explained that I'd need to see some identification and his site badge if he wanted to come through. He got even more worked up and announced that he'd been a county commissioner for 12 years and had an easement to use this road. I tried explaining that everyone needed a badge now, no exceptions, but he just gunned his engine and sped right past me. This became his regular routine. Show up, make a big scene about his former political office, then blow past the checkpoint when I wouldn't let him through without proper authorization. The situation got worse after someone stole a massive spool of copper wire from the site. The thieves had used that back road to haul it out, so management installed a heavy steel cattle gate and told us to keep it locked except during shift changes. They also bumped us up to 2 guards, one at the main entrance and one patrolling. When this former commissioner really lost it, he started ramming his truck against the gate, demanding we open it immediately. The other guards told me he was deliberately trying to get arrested so he could take the property owner to court over the easement issue. The thing is, there was another road that connected to the public highway from behind his cabin. It was rougher and took longer, but it was definitely passable with a 4-wheel drive. That killed any legitimate easement claim he might have had. The confrontation that ended everything happened on a Sunday afternoon. A crew had come in for overtime work to fix something in one of the turbine housings that couldn't wait until Monday. I was manning the gate when I heard his truck coming up the access road, engine revving louder than necessary. He pulled right up to the gate and started his usual routine. He demanded I open the gate immediately because he had business to attend to on his property. I reminded him that he knew he needed a site badge to come through and that the office was open Monday through Friday if he wanted to get one. He got furious and shouted that he didn't need any badge because he had an easement. I walked over to start closing the gate, which was my standard procedure when someone wouldn't comply. When I began swinging it shut, he lurched his truck forward like he was going to ram through it. So I stopped and positioned myself directly in front of his bumper. I told him he wasn't going to run me over because he knew that would destroy any chance he had of getting what he wanted. He sat there for a minute, engine idling, probably realizing I was right. Then he tried a different approach. He announced that he was going to sit there and block the road until I let him through or called the police. I explained that was his choice, but there was a crew working overtime up there, and I wasn't going to stop them from doing whatever they needed to do to get home to their families. When he demanded I call the sheriff immediately. This is where it got interesting. My supervisor has specifically told me not to call the police on this guy. The company didn't want the hassle, they just wanted him to come back during business hours and get a proper badge like everyone else. I told him I wasn't calling anyone since he was outside the gate and not blocking anything important. He asked if I had a phone in the shack. I said no. Then he asked about a cell phone. I lied and said I didn't have one either. This was back when cell phones weren't nearly as common, so it was believable. He kept pushing though. He mentioned he had a cell phone but didn't want to call 911 since this wasn't really an emergency. Then he asked if I had a phone book so he could call the sheriff's department directly. I went and grabbed the phone book from the shack. He flipped through it, found the non-emergency number, and tried one more time to get me to make the call for him. He handed me his phone and told me to call him, and explained there was a situation out here. I refused and told him to do whatever he thought he needed to do, so he did. He actually called the sheriff's department on himself, told them there was some kind of dispute at the wind farm construction site, and requested an officer come out. After he hung up, he moved his truck to the side of the road and just waited. I mentioned that the deputies would ask me what was going on when they arrived. He seemed pleased and told me to explain that he was being illegally prevented from accessing his property. About 30 minutes later, the first deputy arrived. Since I was the security guard, he came to me first. He asked what the situation was. I explained that the gentleman had called them out because he wanted to drive through the construction site without the required badge. I added that he wasn't breaking any laws that I could see since he was on a public road outside our gate and not blocking anything. The deputy shook his head and walked over to talk to the former commissioner. I could see him getting more and more animated when he explained his side of the story. Meanwhile, the crew that had been working on the turbine came down the hill to see what all the commotion was about. One of the workers asked what was going on. I explained that the guy had called the sheriff on himself because I wouldn't let him through the gate without a badge. The workers all started laughing and headed to their trucks to go home. But more deputies kept showing up. Must have been a slow day because eventually there were 5 patrol cars parked along that dirt road. I watched the officers huddled together discussing the situation. A couple of them were clearly trying not to laugh. After about 45 minutes, one of them walked back over to the former commissioner's truck with a citation book. The deputy told him he was getting a ticket for filing a false police report. The former commissioner seemed thrilled and declared that now he'd get his day in court. He snatched the ticket, rolled up his window, and peeled out down the road. The deputies who were still packing up their gear were openly chuckling now. One of the remaining deputies mentioned that, yeah, he'd get his day in court all right, just not the kind he was expecting. Turns out filing a false police report is a misdemeanor that carries a fine and possible jail time. When his court date came around, the judge was not impressed with someone who had once held public office wasting police resources over a civil dispute he could have resolved by simply filling out paperwork during business hours. He ended up paying a hefty fine and never got his precious easement. The construction company finished the wind farm without any more incidents, and I never saw him again. I heard he eventually sold his cabin and moved somewhere else, probably to find new people to harass with his former title and imaginary legal expertise. I moved to this new city back in November 2009 for a fresh start. Just graduated college and landed my first real job that would start December 1st. I had about 3 weeks to kill and needed to find a place to live on my tight budget. That's how I ended up scrolling through Craigslist ads. While jamming to I Got a Feeling by the Black Eyed Peas. I found this listing for a basement apartment that seemed too good to be true. Cheap rent, available immediately, decent photos. I called a number and arranged to see it that afternoon. The landlady who met me was this stocky woman with a severe Betty Page haircut and an attitude to match. She barely made eye contact as she showed me around the cramped basement unit. The place wasn't winning any beauty contests, but the price was right for someone living off savings until their first paycheck. I told her the place worked for me and asked when I could move in. She said she needed the deposit first, $450, which was half a month's rent. If I could get that to her by end of business that day, the apartment would be mine. I practically sprinted to the bank. This was perfect timing since I needed somewhere to crash instead of wearing out my welcome on my buddy's couch. I came back with the cash and we signed a standard lease agreement right there on her kitchen table. When I asked about getting the keys, she told me to give her a couple days since the current tenant still had some stuff to clear out. Fair enough. I went back to my friend's place to wait it out. 2 days passed, then 3, then 4. I started getting antsy and left a few voicemails that probably came across more irritated than I intended. But she never called back. Finally, after a week of silence, I got a voicemail from her. She apologized and said she couldn't rent to me after all because the current tenant had decided to stay. I was furious but tried to keep my cool. I'd never dealt with anything like this before, so I did what any reasonable person would do and looked up tenant laws online. Turns out when someone backs out of a signed lease without legal cause, they owe double the deposit. That meant this woman owed me $900. I called her repeatedly, left emails, nothing. Complete radio silence. Since my job didn't start for another week, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I bought a magazine, hopped on the bus, and planted myself at the stop across from her house. If she was avoiding my calls, maybe a face-to-face conversation would be more productive. After sitting there for about 3 hours, I hit the jackpot. Karen came out of the house with some guy in tow, clearly showing him the basement unit. She was running the exact same routine she'd pulled on me. I waited until her prospective victim left, then walked straight up to her front door and knocked. The second she saw me through the window, her face went pale. She opened the door and immediately started babbling about how the tenant had changed their mind at the last second and decided not to move out after all. She claimed that's why she couldn't rent to me and kept apologizing for the confusion. I cut her off and told her to stop lying. I explained that I'd just watched her show the unit to someone else and that she owed me $900, according to state law. I made it clear she needed to get me that money by the end of the day, or I was walking straight to the police station. She looked like she was about to throw up right there on her doorstep. Her hands started shaking as she asked me to wait and said she'd get my money. I honestly thought she'd try to negotiate or make more excuses, but she just disappeared upstairs. 5 minutes later, she came back with this crumpled wad of cash and practically threw it at my chest. She complained that this was ruining her Christmas, but handed over the money anyway. I thanked her politely and told her to have a nice day. I counted the bills right there in front of her. 900 exactly. Then I walked to the bus stop and rode back to my friend's place without looking back once. I was feeling pretty good about standing up for myself and getting double my money back. Figured it would make for a nice little Christmas bonus. But about a week later, my friend called me with some wild news. He told me to turn on Channel 7 and asked if the woman on screen was the same crazy landlady I'd told him about. Sure enough, there was Karen on the evening news. Apparently, she'd been running the same scam on dozens of people all across the city, taking deposits from multiple people for the same unit, then disappearing with everyone's money. My stomach dropped. I realized the $900 in my wallet probably belonged to other victims who were now homeless right before the holidays. I felt sick. I drove straight to the police station. where there was literally a line of people waiting to file complaints against this woman. Some were crying, others looked completely defeated. When my turn came, I sat down with the intake officer and explained that I needed to report something about the rental scam case. I told her I gotten money from the suspect that probably belonged to other victims. She asked me to explain what happened, so I laid out everything. How Karen had tried to scam me, how I researched the law, staked out her house, confronted her, and demanded double damages. The officer asked if I'd actually gotten money back from Karen. When I confirmed that I had but thought it belonged to the other victims who got scammed, she looked at me for a long moment and started laughing. She told me I was the only person smart enough to handle this the right way. I'd followed the law and enforced my rights, so that money was mine. She said I shouldn't feel bad about it. As I was leaving the station, one of the victims who'd been waiting in line approached me. She asked if I'd really gotten money back from that woman. I sheepishly admitted that I'd actually gotten double my deposit back when I threatened to involve the police. She stared at me for a few seconds, then broke into a huge grin and started clapping slowly. She announced to everyone in the waiting room that I'd taken Karen for double damages. I wanted to crawl into a hole, but then something amazing happened. The entire waiting room of victims started applauding. They were cheering and laughing, and suddenly the whole mood shifted from despair to celebration. One guy shouted that it was good for me. Another woman yelled that she was glad someone had screwed Karen back. Even the cops were cracking up. Yeah, these people lost their money, but at least someone had fought back and won. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.